And then hopefully, I don't actually know how to check if we're live. I think I have to go on YouTube. Let me check. Oh, we are live. Wonderful. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the People's Academy. We're now in the third unit of the second chapter of our curriculum, which looks at imperialism. Last time we were joined by Professor Ali Kadri, and we studied his work, The Accumulation of Waste. We looked at how war and the destruction of human lives and nature are profitable for capitalism, which not only commodifies death, commodifies pollutants, and commodifies other forms of waste, but also through the extreme violence that it wields against the global south. It creates the condition in which labor and resources are cheapened, are undervalued, which undermines countries' struggles for sovereignty. So in this way, war is revealed not as a burden on capitalist economies, as many would insist today, but within imperialism as a central tool of capitalist accumulation, which beats countries and people into submission until they are prepared to surrender their work or their resources cheaply. And today we turn to that question of self-determination, or more concretely to the national question, which really refers to a broad set of concerns relating to the exercise of sovereignty within the state. We will consider questions of self-determination. We'll consider questions of nationalism and whether it's possible to distinguish between the nationalism of the imperialist countries and the nationalism of the oppressed. And we will consider finally how the national struggle relates to the international struggle and the question of imperialism, and look at how we, as popular movements, so various political forces, relate to non-socialist formations in the global periphery that are engaged in these struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. And here to help us tackle these questions is Dr. Jeannette Graulau, who is a professor of political science at Lehman College at the City University of New York, where she teaches classical political economy of development, and globalization history. Jeannette has published on mining and development and Marxist analysis of extractivism in the Journal of Dialectical Anthropology, in the Journal of Agrarian Change, and the Journal of Historical Sociology. Extractive Industries and Society, Continuity and Change, and the International Review of Social History, among many other papers. She also published a book titled The Underground Wealth of Nations, and has a second book coming out soon, hopefully, on mining and power. And finally, she is a founding member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. Jeannette, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it is a pleasure to join the People's Academy and the Progressive International on what I believe is an urgent, timely, and relevant education project. I would like to begin by invite all the students who are joining us today that with great political audacity, we begin thinking, or try to think, like Lenin and Cabral did, about the world and the map of the world they had in front of their eyes. If you, and I'm pretty sure you are all familiar with the works of Lenin and the works of Cabral, but if you dig deep like a miner in today's readings, you are going to notice that the way they thought of the world, the meaningful chronology of the history of the world, was one that emphasized long-term development. This is what Cabral called historical processes. but it were long-term developments that set in motion the predicament and the condition for national liberation. They are both going to emphasize that this condition, the need to struggle for national liberation, was ultimately rooted in long-term developments, especially two I want to emphasize today. Now, why we must begin with what looks like a bit of a painful analytical exercise? Because this is exactly what Lenin and Cabral did. Lenin spent roughly more than 2 decades studying, reading, while fully immersed in working class struggles of Europe in the 19th century, while fully immersed in the Russian working class struggle against the Tsarist autocracy. Cabral did the same while fully immersed, while building a nationalist revolutionary struggle that placed West Atlantic Africa, especially Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands, on world stage. While they built revolutions, they studied revolutions. While they built struggles for national emancipation and national liberation, they spent a great deal of time discussing with comrades, arguing with comrades about the presuppositions and the premises, what Lenin is going to call the building blocks of a theory of revolutionary change. So this is why we must begin with the most painful task ahead of us, which is analyze long-term historical developments. Now, I want to say that Lenin and Cabral, I'm delighted that the People's Academy put together Lenin and Cabral for this unit, because here we have two of the most transcendental revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. Think that on this side of the Atlantic, and where I come from, to say Lenin, to think along the lines of Leninism and Leninist theory is to stand against reformism and populism. To say Lenin is to say that you stand against senseless anarchy. To say Lenin is to say that you are committed to a principled examination of economic reality. This is exactly the same of Cabral too, writing and living the political turmoil, the political events that led to the greatest, or some of the greatest nationalist revolutions of Africa. Cabral was a man who took the anti-imperialist Leninist understanding of the world, an understanding of the map of imperialism and the map of finance capital, and Cabral kind of Africanized that Leninist understanding of imperialism. So this is why I am delighted that the People's Academy put together, rightly so, these two transcendental revolutionary figures. Now, as you already know, what Lenin and Cabral are going to argue is that the dynamics of imperialist competition in 19th century Europe, the workings of imperialist competition in 19th century Europe led to the rise of new colonies in Africa. And it led to the rise of new colonies in Africa. What exactly is a new colony is a big theoretical and analytical question. But for now, let's say that both agreed that these new colonies that emerged in the 19th century, that these new colonies were kind of colonial formations superimposed upon an old but dynamic and still in the making colonized map of Africa. So they are going to identify as the first long-term historical development this inter-imperialist competition in Europe. This is what Marxist historians call, for very strong historical reasons, the scramble for Africa. But there is a second long-term historical development, and it was that for both Lenin and Cabral, it was the reality, the fact that these new colonies that emerged that were the product of European imperialist competition in the 19th century, that these new colonies were subjected to the domination by finance capital. Finance capital having reached a stage of monopoly on a world scale, or, this is Lenin's words, or what Cabral called colonized nations subjugated by imperialist capital. We have then two major objective forces that were not independent, could not act separated from one another. So there was no isolation between these developments, quite the contrary, quite the contrary. These two thinkers argued that these forces constituted one single historical process still in the making. This is the first important analytical contribution of Lenin and Cabral to the analysis of imperialism and the forms imperialism and imperialist domination takes in the periphery. Now, it is not just that these were two forces, two sides of one single coin, but it is that the workings of this one single world-encompassing historical process, the mechanisms, the dynamics of change that propelled this historical phenomenon obviously had radically different manifestations in industrialized core economies and the colonized nations. In the reading by Lenin, what can we say about Lenin? Lenin remains the maximum aspiration of revolutionary thinkers after his death in the 20th century and in the 21st century. And you're going to understand why when you go over some of the statements that summarize these ideas in Lenin's reading. Lenin says, speaking to the working class of Europe, speaking to the industrial proletariat of Europe, Lenin is telling them, compelling them to think that domination by finance capital cannot be accomplished by reforming political democracy. As simple as that. Lenin also is going to, again, anchor an entire discussion of the role of the industrial or working class in the first world, the role of the political and historical role of this class based upon this analysis. And Lenin is going to tell them, demanding national liberation, demanding emancipation of colonies, demanding liberation of colonized nations, cannot take place without a series of revolutions. Lenin set the tone, set the debate. Of course, the work of Lenin, as you all know, right, the statements, the messages, the analysis, the lucidity of this analytical proposition will have tremendous implications for how Lenin and Leninists following Lenin, how they thought about proletariat internationalism. Kind of the question that Pavel was introducing minutes earlier. What does international working class solidarity mean if this one single historical process of development, which is the development of material forces of the capitalist world economy, producing radically different concrete realities in industrialized core economies and colonized nations. Well, under this scenario, what exactly international working class solidarity mean? To Lenin, it was very clear, as you read in today's readings. To Lenin, it meant that we had to build a united front against imperialism, but a united front that took stock of the history, the theory, and the analysis of imperialism. It could only lead to revolutionary change. Then we have Amílcar Cabral. Cabral, I have to say, is a man of, in my view, he Africanized anti-imperialist theories. He created an African nationalist theory of revolutionary change. And he did so by dispensing with complicated theoretical jargon, by dispensing with kind of convoluted ideas. He could not afford the luxury of indulging a first world or a middle class audience with such language, for reasons that have a lot to do with, obviously, the enduring, ongoing, long-term history of imperialism in Africa. The first thing Cabral is going to say is that the history of imperialism in Africa is history in the making. History in the making. That the 19th century imperialist European competition, along with the rise of monopoly finance capital, that this phenomenon is going to kind of imposed upon colonized subjects, imposed upon colonized nations, a territorial logic, not just for the sake of saving capital, but a territorial logic that only creates imperialist violence. And his view on violence, on what imperialist violence looked like, on which territories received the most enduring impact of imperialist violence, is slightly different than other Marxists of the period who had a more bourgeois understanding of violence. Let's take his theory by part. Let's take his theory as he built it. He's going to argue that if it is true that 19th century European imperialist competition led to the rise of new colonial formations in Africa, what needs to be emphasized is that the rise of these new colonies in Africa was a historical necessity. These are his words, that it was a historical necessity or a consequence of the capitalist mode of production. This is a phenomenal statement. If it is a historical necessity or a consequence of the development of the capitalist mode of production, then it is imperialist violence, subjugation of colonized nations by finance capital, subjugation of African colonies then becomes an organic consequence of the technological transformations of the mode of production. This I have to say, you cannot get more revolutionary than this. You cannot get more revolutionary than this. So in other words, it is not that colonial societies, new colonial formations, and he's going to make a very robust analytical distinction between colonial and neo-colonial formations. It is not that they were side effects of European capital expansion to Africa. It is that historically, the expansion of finance capital working under the conditions of the law of accumulation, meaning seeking only to do the only thing finance capital can do, build the conditions for ceaseless accumulation of profits. It meant to Cabral that then imperialist violence colonized subjects, what he calls economic misery of Portuguese colonies in Africa. This was the only phase that imperialism and capital could have in the periphery. I emphasize this is the best product of imperialism and capital in the periphery. Now, when he says historical necessity, and I invite you to go beyond the readings listed in the curriculum and read everything you find of Amílcar Cabral. If there are some of his earliest works, such as works on erosion of agrarian soils in Portugal, written in 1949 when he was a student, I invite you to read everything, For you are going to notice immediately that Amílcar Cabral was a man riding on the tide of revolutionary change at a very early age, riding on top of that tide, commanding the winds of change, arming and building what of the nation. Amílcar Cabral was developing all these elements of his theory since the late 1940s. So when he writes on the historical necessity, colonized nations exploited, subjugated by finance capital, colonized nations where economic misery became the law of motion of empire and capital. When Amílcar Cabral describes what this economic misery looked like, you have to imagine that he was armed to the teeth. I cannot think of any other African revolutionary thinker of the extraordinary group of revolutionary thinkers that the 20th century gave us and the 21st century is giving us. I cannot think of anyone more committed to develop this principled examination of colonial realities than Amílcar Cabral. And from the reading, and I'm just going to briefly share with you some details that he shares, what he calls the economic realities of imperialism and capital in the Portuguese colonies of Africa, for you to get an idea of the judicious, patient, but scrupulous anti-imperialist examination this man is making of the conditions of colonized nations. Think, for example, that only in Angola, Portuguese colonists controlled 4/5 of all coffee plantations. Think, for example, that in Mozambique, half of the cultivated land of the country in 1950s, half of the total cultivated land of the country belonged to a European minority. In Sao Tome, all cultivated lands planted with cacao bean trees and coffees belonged to European colonists. Portugal had 380 doctors working in its colonies in Africa, covering a population, taking care of the health of a population that reached 11 million Africans. 380 doctors for 11 million Africans. Infant mortality rates in Portuguese colonies in the early 1960s reached 40%. And in some regions, what Amilcar Cabral called the bushes of Guinea, regions that he knew very well, not only because of his guerrilla activities, but also because he was an agronomist. In some of the bushes, infant mortality rates reached 80%. Above all, and you know all this because Cabral made this point with great lucidity in almost every single essay he produced in his formidable political writings of the 1960s. None of the colonies of Portugal in Africa had a university. We take for granted, well, some of us can take for granted books, universities, infrastructure, but this was not the case of African colonies. 99% of all Africans subjected to Portuguese imperial domination, 99% were illiterate. Now you have to think of these numbers dialectically. Dialectically means that it forced his comrades to use native tongues, native languages to spread the message of revolution, to try to educate tribal chiefs, different ethnic groups, different tribal populations, to try to compel them to enter into the struggle for national liberation. But no African language was taught in schools. And obviously the historic ties between ethnic populations, tribal populations, the political fabric of chiefdoms of West Atlantic Africa was totally broken by Portuguese colonial domination. Now, Cabral is going to say that the process then of finance capital that expanded everywhere, along with European empires in the 19th century. Again, recall that it is one single historical process in motion and in the making. While this process created masses of labor and capital everywhere, and take out of your mind, if you are thinking about wage labor as the standard that Amilcar Cabral has in his head, that's not what he's speaking about. He's speaking about different forms of labor. So the expansion of European empires and finance capital, creating masses of labor and capital everywhere, creating surplus value and profits on a world scale, obviously did not trigger the promise of development in African colonies. It could only trigger, again, what he called imperialist violence. Now, what was this promise of development of capital? And this is where I believe that Cabral is forcing the works of Lenin, the words of Lenin and the words of Marx to make sense of a continental reality that Marx Orientalism kind of neglected. Cabral did not have to say it with these words. This is not the historical and political vocabulary of Cabral. But Cabral is going to argue that the empire, that imperial capital played a developmental role, obviously, on behalf of imperialist core economies. That capital does what the capital did in Europe, what capital is supposed to do. Capital is supposed to push and propel the technological forces forward. And while doing so, in Europe, Cabral says, in Europe, capital obviously is going to trigger class structures, obviously is going to deepen class antagonisms, obviously is going to trigger clashes between the haves and the have-nots, but it is going to do so while increasing the complexity of productive forces. This is a higher stage of revolutionary theory. This is higher stage revolutionary theory. He's saying, when I look at this single historical process in motion, the face of Europe, shaped, altered, and dynamically charged by this process, I see that there is an increasing standards of living, even for the industrial proletariat of Europe. The worst industrial proletariat faction of the working class of Europe still enjoys good standards of living compared to the best worker of any of the African colonies in Africa in this period. It simply means for Cabral that capital, that Cabral is recognizing that capital is the motor for material change and material progress of societies. But given the history of imperialism, when this capital confronts itself with the nations of colonized peoples, here he's going to introduce a second or third important analytical concept, the nation. When this capital faces, is challenged and confronts nations of colonized subjects, this capital can only trigger imperialist violence. Imperialist violence then in the colonies in Africa obviously acquires its own dynamic life. Imperialist violence, you have to think of it as Cabral did, as a structure that is systemically dependent and systemically related to imperialism and finance capital. But once the instrumentality of imperialist violence reaches colonized peoples, it can only trigger more imperialist violence. And I don't need to say here, but I'm going to say it anyhow, that if anyone dares to doubt this statement, the dialectics of imperialist violence, if anyone dares to doubt it, all you have to think about is the current genocide in Gaza. And Amilcar Cabral in various essays is going to remind you, well, these and these tribal populations and ethnic groups in Africa were the victims of genocide. In other writings, after the first tricontinental meeting in Havana, Cuba, where Cabral delivered a magnificent speech on the weapon of theory, Cabral is going to make remarks there about genocide, what imperialist violence looks like in the colonies. The fact that imperialist violence is going to take a life of its own. It cannot be otherwise. And this life of its own always deepens and dynamizes violence. Simply means that there is a shared reality of colonized nations that colonized nations have to take seriously. So he is now, right, entering into the urgent and important question of international class solidarity, but fundamentally solidarity in action and solidarity in theoretical thinking. Make no mistake, there is one beautiful essay, I forgot the title, where written in the 1950s, where I think Cabral is discussing some of the party principles, where Cabral is speaking to his comrades, and Cabral says, does this sound too theoretical? Well, it has to be. It has to be theoretical, because solidarity in action, given the weaknesses, the internal weaknesses of colonized nations under the conditions that I just described, solidarity in action has to walk side by side a robust theoretical explanation for the shared historical experience of colonized nations of the world. I want to mention two additional points on this shared historical experience. The shared historical experience, right, that has a lot to do with the loss of motion of imperialist violence. With the loss of motion of imperialist violence. It is this shared historical experience what dictates the need for national liberation. The need for national liberation is not an ideological cliche. No, the bourgeoisie and the ruling class, they make ideology. We Marxists and Leninists, we build analysis, political economy analysis. And Cabral is very clear on this point. It determines the need for national liberation. What does national liberation look like under these conditions? Here he wrote an entire guerrilla manual adapted to the specific environmental, geographic, tribal, cultural, and historical realities of Africa, praising the guerrilla experiences of other nationalist revolutionary movements of the times. But Cabral is going to say it's our nationalist revolutionary movement is unique. And it's unique for two fundamental reasons. The first one has a lot to do with nation. The question of nation is central to his theory of national liberation, but also to the tactics of guerrilla warfare, and we won't have a time to discuss it. But since you all realize that Africa is part of the old world, right? People think that not us, but some people out there think that the history of Africa began in 1492. And some Marxists, mainstream Marxists, even worse, they think that Africa had no history until the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the British Empire. You have to imagine that this is not the notion. This ideological nonsense is not what Cabral has in mind. Cabral is going to argue that given the robust history of African nations, it's a history that predates the rise of the mode of production, the rise of the capitalist mode of production. It is a history that was walking towards its own path before the imposition of imperialist capital by European empires, given that Africa is a living nation with its complexities, its contradictions, its own realities. The act of affirming a national culture the act of emphasizing, of living, of reorienting and rerouting the culture of colonized peoples in Africa is in itself the beginnings of a revolutionary process, or the beginnings of what he calls a process of gaining national consciousness on the need to struggle for national liberation. It's phenomenal. We have lamentably no time to discuss this question of culture, but he sees culture as a weapon for national liberation. Given again the history of African nations, which is a history that was obviously pivotal for the rise of the West. A second important point and with this I'll give a chance for comrades and students of the Academy to raise questions and share your impressions of the readings. But the second important point obviously has a lot to do with the centrality of armed struggle. Armed struggle is a big thing, was a big thing in the 1960s, was a predicament of most guerrilla movements, of all guerrilla movements, I should say, was a predicament of most nationalist movements, but was a fundamental condition of revolutionary movements. And Cabral is going to argue that the logic of imperialist violence in the periphery, the logic of imperialist violence leaves the periphery, leaves nations no other choice. He didn't call it violence, by the way. He called it liberating violence. Another big concept of Amilcar Cabral. It was the idea that very loyal to Leninist understanding of struggle, very loyal to Leninist understanding of anti-imperialism, but fully anchored in a principled and patient examination of African reality. Cabral is going to argue that liberating violence is the path, is the vehicle, is the instrument for national liberation. When he's sharing these building blocks of his theory of revolutionary change, you have to imagine that American capital was preparing itself to do two things. The American empire was preparing itself to reorient its military and geopolitical goals on a world scale, given that American capital in the 1960s was beginning to suffer from a disease it has not been able to cure yet. And it is the disease of the falling rate of profits. American capital is going to enter into a decades-long systemic crisis that is going to obviously force the empire to go after all of these guerrilla movements, not just the guerrilla movements in Africa, but especially guerrilla movements in Latin America. So when Amilcar Cabral is sharing with other nationalists and other revolutionary thinkers the incipient building blocks of his African nationalist theory of revolutionary change, you have to imagine that more than ever, the empire concentrated much of its efforts in these movements. It was a frontal attack. It was a frontal attack along with the Cuban Revolution, the success of the Cuban Revolution, along with the success of other revolutionary movements, and even along with rising military nationalist movements. Don't forget Omar Torrijos in Panama. Don't forget Velasco Alvarado in Peru, along with new nationalist movements that did not come from the shared predicament of guerrilla warfare. Well, Amilcar Cabral is sending this message to all about the need to build, the need to dig deep in each specific concrete reality of all colonized nations to fight what you had to fight in your nations, so that this national liberation movement could have a spillover effect and finally eradicate the imperialist subjugation of these nations. I'm not sure, Pavel, if you want me to give you a chance to raise questions. You warned me a couple of days ago.
Yes, we could. Absolutely. We have 10 minutes left, and I think that's just enough time to maybe raise one final issue. And a question we often get from participants in the program is that, of course, it's clear that solidarities are built out of shared experience of oppression. But if we shift the geographic axis of internationalism a little bit and think about the relationship of movements in the global north, in the imperialist core, with anti-colonial forces in the global south, the question emerges, what should the orientation of our solidarities be if we are in the global north? And in a sense, Cabral gives us an answer, right? In one of the earlier units of the People's Academy, we looked at the debates of the Third International, in which, and again, this is an interesting way in which Lenin and Cabral connect, in which the issue was raised of, as you mentioned today, of the capacity of imperialism to, in a sense, buy the consent of the European working classes by generating standards of living that prevent the emergence of revolutionary movements. And this idea was expressed that until those arteries of imperial plunder are broken, as long as the European ruling classes can feed off the labor and wealth of the global peripheries, a revolution won't emerge in the global north. And Cabral took those ideas and, in a sense, realized them. Because, as many of you will know, Portugal was a founding member of NATO. Portugal was a fascist dictatorship, which was also deeply oppressive to its own people. And Portugal was, of course, fed by its colonial possessions. And it was the wars of national liberation that helped create the conditions for the overthrow of that fascist regime in Portugal in 1974. Really a tremendous blow to NATO, and Amilcar Cabral writes in his many writings about the kinds of weapons he finds on the battlefield of the struggle for liberation, which are the same kind of weapons we find on the battlefield in Israel and Western Sahara and elsewhere, occupied Palestine and occupied Western Sahara and elsewhere. They come from the full NATO bloc. And so I think that gives us a sense of the kind of orientations that forces in the global north need to have in relation to forces of national liberation in the global south. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, maybe thinking about today's context.
Yes, sure. I think this is the challenge. It's an analytical challenge. It's obviously a theoretical challenge, a political economy challenge for people like me interested in questions of political economy. But it's also a more humane, down-to-earth challenge. It's how we relate to each other. And I am going to quote Cabral. Cabral has a beautiful expression addressing more or less this question: the role of working classes from different nations, the role of different factions of the working class, even in colonized nations. Cabral is going to say each one has a role to play if and only if we all share revolutionary consciousness. And he cites Fidel Castro. He says, the Cuban Revolution taught us that the Cuban Revolution had to develop a very humane approach with its dissidents. He said it in the Tricontinental meeting in Havana. He said it to the face of Fidel Castro. He said, you guys developed a very humane approach. Perhaps we need to build, we all need to learn, right? To analyze our internal weaknesses and be able to transcend those again, pending that we all share this revolutionary consciousness. And the reason is simple. We have no other option. We have no other option. Imperialist violence is not a phenomenon exclusively. It does not belong to colonized nations. Imperialist violence is the organic manifestation of imperialism everywhere. But in colonized nations, it takes the face that Cabral described. So the fact that we have no other option because we are all part of the promise and the struggle for a world free of imperialism means that we have to take seriously the words of Cabral. And these are the words of Cabral. Cabral said to his audience in Havana, speaking precisely about this question: what is the role of factions and working classes from different parts of the world? Cabral said, we all play a role because to all, imperialism is piracy transplanted from the seas to dry land. Piracy reorganized, consolidated, and adapted to the aim of plundering the natural and human resources of our peoples, but also of other peoples of the world. To all of us, imperialism is capital in action. This, I believe, Pavel, gives us the slogan, the banner, right, for betting at the possibility of transcending historical and political divisions and build together the solid foundations for a truly anti-imperialist internationalist movement.
Jeannette, thank you so much. I think that's a very powerful note on which to end this lecture today, or begin wrapping up this lecture. I'll just say a few words about the next stage in the program. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a lecture on imperialism and international law, and about the way in which, building these infrastructures on top of imperialism that secure impunity for the perpetrators of imperial crimes, or facilitate the international movements of capital in the ways that you described. So we're going to be studying international law as a construct of imperialism in 2 weeks' time. And I really liked today how much you brought in of Amilcar Cabral's thinking into this lecture. I think he's such a wonderful and important person to study. And maybe I'll end on one quote that I found a few days ago from his writings on education, which might as well be a kind of mission statement for this wider program, and speaks to what you were talking about, Jeannette, just now. And the quote is this: whether in Cape Verde or anywhere else in the world, education is the fundamental basis that underpins the work of the emancipation of every human being and the conscientization of mankind, not in relation to individual or class needs or conveniences, but in relation to the environment in which he lives, to the needs of the community, and to the problems of humanity in general. Today, education aims at the full realization of man without distinguishing race or origin, as a conscious and intelligent, useful and progressive being, integrated into the world and his geographic, economic, and social environment without any sort of submission. For this, and because of this, the issue of education cannot be treated separately from the socio-economic question. Very powerful quote, very powerful motivator for us on this course. So once again, Jeannette, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that joined today. As always, these lectures will remain available indefinitely on our YouTube channel, so you can come back and revisit them at any time.
Thank you for having me.